Hi, I'm Nate Seberg, and this is One Day Ahead. Welcome to Of Mice and Men, Chapter 3. If you're a teacher, check out onedayahead.com, where you can find all of this series, videos about teaching it, and a full unit. Finally, this is not a spoiler-free video, fair warning, but if you're good to go, then walk your dog and bring a shovel, as we dive into Of Mice and Men, Chapter 3. Chapter 3 is huge for Lennie, because he got a puppy. It's one of Slim's, and we catch him and George talking about it before Slim steers the conversation into why George and Lennie are traveling together at all. Slim's inability to understand decency, unmotivated by exploitation, shows just how hard this world is. Steinbeck put this in case the puppy murder last chapter didn't make that clear. It just seems kind of funny, a cuckoo like him and a smart guy like you traveling together. We learned they grew up together and that George took over Lennie's care after Lennie's Aunt Clara passed away. At first, George messed with Lennie, once telling him to jump in a river even though he couldn't swim. When Lennie leapt in without a second thought and nearly drowned, George felt ashamed and finally shouldered the weight of his responsibility. He has cared for Lennie ever since, including and especially when he gets in trouble. For example, Lennie likes to feel soft things, which is fine until he feels the dress of a girl on the farm at his last job in Weed. She freaked out, Lennie panicked, and in his terror just held on harder. It took George hitting him over the head with a fence post before he let go. The girl ran for help, claimed rape, raised a lynch mob, and the guys spent the day hiding in an irrigation ditch and running for their lives. This little episode is the trouble in Weed they mentioned back in chapter 1. It's after this story that Slim passes judgment on Lennie, and this is important because he is the only other character who will see what's really going on at the end of the novel. "He ain't mean," said Slim. "I can tell a mean guy a mile off." Candy walking in ends this conversation. If you can't remember who he is because there's Candy, Curley, Carlson, Crooks, use the phrase my students came up with, which is Candy ain't handy, which is mean but also true. Curley is accompanied by his ancient and rancid-smelling dog, and when Carlson turns up, he stopped and sniffed the air, and still sniffing, looked down at the dog. "God almighty, that dog stinks. Get him out of here, Candy. I don't know nothing that stinks as bad as an old dog." He continues, "Got no teeth, he's all stiff with rheumatism, he ain't no good to you, Candy, and he ain't no good to himself. Why don't you shoot him, Candy?" I like that there is no daylight at all between bad smells and summary execution. There's nowhere on this ranch is there a bathtub. So Candy's had this dog since he was a puppy, but Carlson won't be dissuaded. He points out that the dog is suffering and claims the kind thing to do is to end it quick. And he's got a pistol and everything. Candy turns to Slim. "Carl's right, Candy. That dog ain't no good to himself." Candy looked helplessly at him, for Slim's opinions were law. At last, Candy said softly and hopelessly, "All right, take him." He did not look down at the dog at all. He lay back on his bunk and crossed his arms behind his head and stared at the ceiling. Carlson takes a shovel and leads the dog out, but we stay back in the cabin, and this is a terrible time in the book. The men make small talk and play cards, but it's all meaningless. Everyone is holding their breath for the shot. The tension builds, and it's brutal. The silence is so loud, and Steinbeck lets it drag. Finally, mercifully, a shot sounded in the distance. The men look quickly at the old man, every head turned toward him. For a moment, he continued to stare at the ceiling. Then he rolled slowly over and faced the wall and lay silent. Guys, it is so brutal. And it's also foreshadowing. The incident over, George is invited into town the next night to go to Susie's place. This section where we learn about Susie's, it gets a little cryptic, so let me help you out. Vocab. A parlor house is a brothel, a flop is sex with a prostitute, and a Cupid doll is this thing. Susie apparently likes to throw shade at her competition, saying just because Clara put a rag rug on the floor and a Cupid doll lamp on the phonograph, it doesn't mean she knows how to run a parlor house. That Clara. What an amateur. A rag rug is just what it sounds like, by the way. Cutting up old cloth and weaving it together to make a rug. Susie goes on, "There's guys around here walking bow-legged because they like the look of a Cupid doll lamp." So they're walking bow-legged because they caught a venereal disease after visiting Clara's girls. Based on the time period, it was almost certainly syphilis or gonorrhea. Fun facts. Okay, so we never actually visit Susie's, but George agrees to go tomorrow night. Suddenly, Curley barges in, looking for his wife, which is what he does. He has real Chihuahua energy. When he learns that Slim has been missing for 10 minutes, he assumes, logically, that Slim's off having sex with his wife. Now, Curley being insecure about his wife is standard practice for him, but going after Slim, the de facto leader of all the ranch hands, is a new thing. So the men clear out to see this showdown, leaving George, Lennie, and Candy behind. Lennie asks, "Tell about that place, George." "I just told you, just last night." "Go on, tell again, George." He means tell him about the ranch, the dream that they share together. "Well, it's 10 acres, said George. Got a little windmill. Got a little shack on it and a chicken run. There's a place for alfalfa and plenty of water to flood it. There's a pig pen and rabbits, George. No place for rabbits now, but I could easy build a few hutches and you could feed alfalfa to the rabbits." "Damn right I could," said Lennie. "You're goddamn right I could." This is the old way between them, their old ritual. George continues, his voice growing warmer. "And we could have a few pigs. And when the salmon run up the river, we could catch 100 of them and salt them down or smoke them. Maybe we'd have a cow or a goat, and the cream is so goddamn thick you gotta cut it with a knife and take it out with a spoon." Lennie watched him with wide eyes, and old Candy watched him too. Lennie said softly, "We could live off the fat of the land." This story, this dream, fills a full page as George paints their little slice of heaven. All the while, Candy is listening in. When Candy spoke, they both jumped, as though they had been caught doing something reprehensible. Candy said, "You know where there's a place like that?" At first, George is suspicious, thinking Candy is trying to swoop in, because we learn that this is more than just a dream. This is a real plot of land up for sale, and the owners are desperate to sell. But Candy, just like Lennie and George, is entranced by the promise of something more than working as a simple ranch hand. Singular. Candy reveals that he was given $250 after he lost his hand working on this ranch, and has a further $50 saved up. If Lennie and George work a month and don't spend a dime, they can scrape $450 all told, enough to buy the property. Friends, all of a sudden, this fantasy they have shared for years suddenly and unexpectedly appears attainable. They talk it through, and in a giddy rush, they agree. One more month working on this ranch, and they will pool their money and live happily ever after. Final scene. The guys are back. We're mid-conversation. Slim is mad and Curley is backing down. "If you can't look after your own goddamn wife, what do you expect me to do about it? You lay off of me." "I'm just trying to tell you I didn't mean nothing," said Curley. In this moment, Curley is humiliated and casting about for a new target. He glances around the room and his eyes fall on Lennie, who's still grinning at the thought of the rabbits. Curley's rage explodes. "Come on, you big bastard, get up on your feet. No big son of a bitch is gonna laugh at me. I'll show you who's yella." And Curley attacks, boxing a bewildered Lennie, who retreats around the room, yelling out for George and making no move to fight back. Curley advances, bloody in his nose, hitting his body, Lennie crying out the whole time. Slim wants to jump in and stop this abuse, but George gets there first. He cupped his hands around his mouth and yelled, "Get him, Lennie!" Lennie took his hands away from his face and looked about for George, his big face covered with blood. George yelled again, "I said get him!" Curley's fist was swinging when Lennie reached for it. The next minute, Curley was flopping like a fish on the line, and his closed fist was lost in Lennie's big hand. Lennie catches Curley's punch in midair and simply turns his hand to powder. He breaks every bone and sends him to his knees. And just like the girl and the soft dress, they have trouble getting Lennie to stop. George slapped him in the face again and again, and still Lennie held on to the closed fist. Curley was white and shrunken by now, and his struggling had become weak. Suddenly, Lennie let go his hold. They get Curley to a doctor, and the chapter ends with Lennie, bruised and battered, asking if he can still tend the rabbits. And that's chapter 3. So if we really want to understand this book, we gotta get deeper than just plot. Let's do a little analysis. So let's talk about this dream for the future and its near magical effect on the guys. Take Candy. This poor guy has had a gutting experience. Led by Carlson, the men of the bunkhouse agree it's time to put down Candy's dog, a poochie he has raised since puppyhood. But now the dog is old, it's suffering, and critically, it serves no further purpose. purpose. So the dog is killed, Candy is devastated, and it's now that the dream comes along. Just like the first time we heard it, the promise of someday finding some better version of life serves to soothe the men. On the banks of the river back in chapter 1, it was in the aftermath, and you gotta assume trauma, of narrowly escaping the lynch mob in Weed. And here the magic works again, drawing Candy out of his despair and offering him a lifeline to something better. And I can see why it works, because the dog is very old, disabled, and serves no further purpose. You know who that's starting to sound like? Candy himself. "I got hurt 4 years ago," Candy said. "They'll can me pretty soon. Just as soon as I can't swamp out no bunkhouses, they'll put me on the county." Being put on the county means kicked off the ranch to live on government assistance. Candy knows what happens to the old, the broken, the useless. He just saw a very vivid example, so it makes sense that he is casting about now for hope. But notice what happens the minute the dream is gone. When the other men return and the spell is broken, the temporary balm vanishes, and the reality of his situation comes crashing down with new and terrible clarity. Out of nowhere, Candy says, "George, huh? I ought to have shot that dog myself, George. I shouldn't ought to have let no stranger shoot my dog." It's terrible and sad and true. And friends, it's not even about him or his guilt or his sadness. It's because being there and being the one is something he owed to the dog in its final moments. Stay tuned on this line of thinking, because in a book this short, Steinbeck didn't put that in just 'cause. Finally, what is your hand worth? Let's play a little game. Go ahead and land on a dollar figure for me, something that really captures what you would expect to be paid should your job literally rip your hand off. What sort of check would you expect to get in the mail? Well, we learned that Candy lost my hand right here on this ranch. That's why they gave me a job swamping, and they give me $250. So this book is set sometime in the late 1930s, let's say 31. I'm recording this in 2024. Inflation calculator says $4,819 today. Friends, that is not enough. And this might surprise you, but by the 1930s, California already had robust worker protection laws in place, specifically the California Workers' Compensation Act of 1913, which was born out of the Progressive era. So I'll spare you the details, but the law worked much like it does today. Document the injury, save your receipts, submit a claim to your employer. And they engage in a process that takes into account your current salary, lost future wages, the seriousness of the injury, yada, yada, yada. And friends, taking $50 a month as our wage, because that's what George is making, and setting ridiculously low rates to calculate this indemnity, I can say with confidence that Candy got screwed. Even with the most employer-friendly interpretations of this law, Candy should still be walking away with something more like $5,000 in their money, $97.5 thousand in ours. Dude got $250. But let's be real, this is a shady time. Candy is likely not up on current state labor laws. Plus, even if he wants to fight, what's he gonna do? By my calculations, the probability he can even write a letter of complaint is 50%. Anyway, that, of course, is nonsense. I mean, my math is right, but Steinbeck really did work as a ranch hand in Salinas Valley, and he has spoken publicly about how much of his book is drawing from his first-hand experiences, if you'll excuse the expression. So when it comes to who to believe, I think we can all probably agree it isn't me. And that's chapter 3. Thank you for watching. Next episode, we head to chapter 4, where Candy does some figuring, Lennie does some sitting, and Lulu threatens some murder. All that and more next time on One Day Ahead.